Welcome, everyone. I'm going to assume that this clock is correct, even though it usually isn't. But my job is to get us started on time and to keep us within bounds and so on. My name is George Hunsinger. I'm on the faculty here. I have a book called Karl Barth and Radical Politics, which you can look at in a display table over in the main lounge. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be able to introduce my colleague and old friend Gary Dorrien, with whom I have collaborated here and there over the years. Professor Dorrien is the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Social Ethics at Union Theological Seminary. And among his many books is one that I think is of particular interest to our conference. It's called American Democratic Socialism, History, Politics, Religion, and Theory, published in 2021 by Yale University Press. And if you'd like a kind of detailed overview of the contents of this very large volume, you can turn to a journal called Dissent. I hope you know this journal. If you don't, it's worth looking up. Dissent is published by the Democratic Socialists of America. Professor Dorrien has been a longtime member of the DSA, as have I, and a co-chair of DSA for many years is named Cornel West, who's currently running for president in the United States. And in my opinion, if you want to know what Barth and the political looks like in the United States today, keep your eye on Cornel West. Many of the questions that I have heard raised from the floor here at this conference could be answered by paying attention to Cornel West. This is not just a gratuitous move on my part. He doesn't make a big deal of it, but Cornel West has publicly identified himself on more than one occasion as a Barthian. So you could find that if you poked around online. But without further ado, let me just introduce Professor Dorrien, who will speak about Barth and the political to our convocation.
Oh, thank you, George. Well, good afternoon, friends. It's a delight to see you all here, middle of the afternoon. You don't know how many are going to show up. So it's a delight, and a little bit relieved to see all of you. I'm blown away right away because, I was planning to call out George here early on, thinking that a word needs to be said about him, and then it turns out he's going to introduce me, and then he gave me exactly the introduction I would have wanted. I'm grateful to have mentioned that I have these two big books on democratic socialism that just came out recently. In the first Barth conference I ever attended was in 1998. I had a book coming out on Karl Barth the next year, and I thought, well, I probably should start attending those Barth conferences. So I got here to the auditorium, I think downstairs from the cafeteria. They jammed about 400 people in there. And as far as I could tell that week, the whole thing was put together by George Hunsinger. George just was the life and blood of the Barth studies for years and years and years, and wrote books that are the class of the field, including a wonderful book on how to read Karl Barth. So I was planning to say all this even if he wasn't sitting up here. But then I got him as my introducer. I'm deeply grateful to Hannah and Andrea for the invitation to participate in this conference among such wonderful company, and to Kate and Yanan and others for whipping it into shape. My subject, as you've heard, is Karl Barth and democratic socialism, a subject that brims with interlocutors such as Karl Marx, Karl Kautsky, Edward Bernstein, Christoph Blumhardt, Leonard Ragaz, Hermann Kutter, Paul Tillich. 2 years ago, most of our speakers and a few others held a pre-conference workshop in which one of our colleagues ventured that Barth will be utterly forgotten 10 years from now, and conferences like this one will no longer take place. I hasten to add that this was a beloved colleague to many of us. I believe that Karl Barth soared way too high in his lifetime to ever be forgotten. He was by far the most influential and prolific theologian of the 20th century. But he did not have a critique of the racist sickness of Western civilization, the racist violence and ordering of Western colonialism, or the racist legacy of modern theology. He did not conceive white supremacy as a structure of power based on privilege or interrogate his complicity in it. He was not remotely a feminist, much less an ecofeminist or a critique of heteronormative abuse and denigration. Even his vaunted socialism lacked the transformative relevance of the seven figures I just cited. I will go only so far with the product of his time apologetic, even though I love Karl Barth for all the reasons that my beloved friend Cornel West also regards him highly, because some Christian socialists of his time were much better than Karl Barth. I begin with a bit of table setting about socialism, Christian socialism, and social democracy. Socialism goes back to the 1820s in France and England, where Charles Fourier and Robert Owen were the pioneers. The idea was to achieve the unrealized demands of the French Revolution, which did not reach the working class. Instead of pitting workers against each other, a cooperative mode of production and exchange would allow them to work for each other. Socialism was about organizing society as a cooperative community. All the early traditions of socialism conceived it as producer cooperatives or cooperative producer guilds. The differences between these two models sundered the first movement for Christian socialism in England in the 1850s. As soon as you imagine guild networks overtaking the self-government of cooperatives, you've got two kinds of socialism. Then you get debates over whether government should finance the cooperatives or guilds, which yields the specter of state socialism. At the same time, some contend that none of this is possible without strong industrial unions, so contentions over different kinds of syndicalism arise. By the late 19th century, there were many kinds of socialism. At the same But the fierce conflict between Marxists and anarchists in the First International destroyed the First International. There were 6 kinds of Marxism alone that variously interpreted Marx as a syndicalist, an anarcho-syndicalist utopian, a radical social democrat, a 2-track reformist revolutionary, a communist, or a guild socialist. There were non-Marxian forms of most of these types, plus the Fabian tradition, which said that none of this theorizing is necessary. All we need is for the civilizing growth of democratic government to proceed on its present course to the socialist state, building a collective technocratic government managed by, of course, Fabian experts. In England, that became socialist orthodoxy, opposed by the radical Christian guild socialists that I cheer for. No definition of socialism as collective economies or public or worker control of the economy or any particular ownership scheme is common to the many traditions of socialist thought. Historically, Marxism played the leading role in reducing the idea of socialism to collective ownership, and Fabian socialism played the second leading role in a very different way. Karl Marx taught that the structure of economic ownership determines the character of an entire society, and socialism is the collective ownership of the means of production and exchange, a sufficient condition for fulfilling the essential aspirations of human beings, period. He developed the most powerful critique of capitalism ever conceived, inspiring numerous traditions of socialist criticism. I could not get along for a single day without Karl Marx. His focus on the factors of production and the structural capitalist tendency to generate crises of overproduction and crash made permanent contributions to socialist thought. But Marx's dogmatic determinism, catastrophe mentality, and doctrine of proletarian dictatorship wreaked immense harm. He developed his theory during an era in which democracy was merely a form of government and thus of low importance to him. His denigration of ethical reason obscured his own moral wellspring. And his fixation on collective ownership instilled a magical socialist dogmatism in which anti-racism, feminism, and all other reform causes, so-called reform causes, were relegated to secondary status at best. The very term democratic socialism self-consciously registers something fatefully important about the history of socialism. 19th century British socialists didn't call themselves democratic socialists, even though most of them were, because democracy was not controversial in British socialism. Democracy was controversial in continental Marxism, where Marxists contended that existing democracy was a bourgeois fraud and real democracy would emerge only from a proletarian revolution, after which there would be no need of a state. For a socialist to lionize democracy as the best road to socialism was just ridiculous. Democracy would come by making the state irrelevant, as Marxists believed, or by smashing the state, as anarchists believed. Democratic socialists refused to subordinate democracy and its reform causes to a catastrophe vision of deliverance or the demands of a left-wing dictatorship. They said socialists had to be resolutely democratic and liberal on their way to achieving socialism, and not merely on tactical grounds. Edward Bernstein made the classic case for this position in 1899 in the German Social Democratic Party, SPD. He rocked the SPD by doing so, which sealed the break between its orthodox Marxist wing and its democratic socialist wing. The terms democratic socialist and revisionist have been linked ever since, especially by Marxists. But revisionism is a necessary enterprise in every intellectual tradition, naming the willingness to revise a stagnant orthodoxy. In 1889, socialists founded the Second International, now excluding the anarchists. They still believed that socialist revolutions were inevitable wherever capitalism arose, but not a single one had occurred, so they were forced to rethink what they were doing. The SPD was by far the leading socialist party in Europe. Bernstein said the party was overdue to acknowledge that Marx got many things wrong, and the party's practice was much better than the utopian Marxist theory it espoused. Socialism must be resolutely democratic as means and end. Only a debased socialism would subordinate democracy and its reform causes to a catastrophe vision of deliverance or the demands of a left-wing dictatorship. The SPD had three ideological factions when Christoph Blumhardt, Leonard Ragaz, Hermann Cotter, and Karl Barth entered this story. Bernstein led the pragmatic democratic socialists who pressed for reforms. Rosa Luxemburg led the radical left that agitated for revolutionary action. Karl Kautsky, the leader of the SPD, held the party together in the center left. Kautsky was puckishly called the Pope of Orthodox Marxism, combining a revolutionary ideology with a strategic commitment to electoral politics. Both parts could be justified by the Communist Manifesto, hence the claim to orthodoxy. It was okay to run candidates for office and to make immediate demands, as long as the party only did so for revolutionary purposes. Anything that advanced the revolution could be justified. Bernstein said he didn't believe it, and neither did much of the party. Only the ideologues believed it. The logic that changed the meaning of the term social democracy after World War I was built into this debate. Bernstein became an historic figure by urging socialists to judge their theory by their practice. I have one last table setting point to make about the socialist context that Barth and Ragaz entered. There was no radical German Christian socialist tradition for them to engage. German Christian socialism was feckless, conservative, infected by nationalism, and constrained by the hostility of the SPD. England had Christian socialists of that type too. Comfortable Oxford professors who went to Fabian meetings and believed that English imperialism was a mixed blessing for the rest of the world. But England had a stream of Christian socialists who hated the imperialist gore they were taught in school. Stuart Headlam, Charles Marson, Conrad Knoll, Algernon West, and Maurice Reckitt were ringleaders of an abolitionist Christian socialism that had no parallel in Germany. Ragaz became a socialist of that type by reading them. He came from a farm family in a small mountain village, studied theology at Berlin and Basel, and began his ministry as a neo-Hegelian. He preached liberal theology for 3 years in a mountain village churches. He washed out in 1893, where was that leading? Taught for 2 years, steeped himself in British Christian socialism, and then returned to the Reform ministry. In 1902, he was called to Basel Minster. Kutter came from an engineer's family in Bern, studied theology at Bern and Berlin, and was called to the pulpit of Zurich Neumünster. Both were repulsed by their German counterparts, Adolf Stucker and the later Friedrich Naumann. Stucker founded German Christian socialism in 1878 to lure the working class from social democracy. He was a court chaplain to the Kaiser who thundered that social democrats hated Germany, God, and civilization. He sprinkled anti-Semitic asides into his speeches until he noticed that nothing revved up his crowds like a run of Jew bashing. In the 1890s, Stucker dropped his emphasis on the working class, going full bore for militaristic nationalism. His protege, Naumann, took a different path to the same destination. Naumann was an intellectual who published an influential magazine. For a while, he was the great hope of progressive German Christian socialism. But in the mid-1890s, Naumann took a nationalist turn. He was a pioneer of national existentialism, a crisis trope with a toxic future in Germany. When Ragaz and Kutter looked to Germany for inspiration, they fixed on the same very lone figure, Christoph Blumhardt, the son of a famous faith healer who succeeded his father as an evangelist. Blumhardt tired of the gospel of health, imploring his audiences to pray for the kingdom of God. In 1899, he set off a furor by joining the enemy, the SPD, which welcomed him with a kind of surprised fascination. Blumhardt served a 6-year term as an SPD delegate, contending that social democracy was an unwitting instrument of God's will. The kingdom is about the coming of a new world, achieving what God cares about, which only the socialists cared about in Germany. Kutter and Ragaz wagered that Switzerland was a better place to try Christian socialism, or at least it should be. Kutter was utterly scathing about the shallow conformism of the Swiss Reformed Church. He railed against it in his flaming book of 1903, They Must, God and the Social Democracy, charging that the church was completely corrupt. In Blumhardt's fashion, Kutter said it should make all the difference in the world if you believe in God. The Bible exalts God's glory and longs for God's presence without trying to prove God's existence. Scripture simply attests that God lives, exuding the spiritual power that comes from believing it. He also put it in Calvinist idealistic fashion. In the Bible, only one reality really matters: God. Only God is truly interesting. Kutter piled up antitheses. Socialists were atheists, yet they fought the battle against idolatry that God cares about. German and Swiss Christianity were about loving Germany and Switzerland, offering nothing that God could use. Kutter said Marx was right about violence. Violence is the midwife that delivers a new society. God uses violence to create a new world. Under capitalism, only mammon is great. Mammon produces, governs, determines, and destroys, making everything small and mercenary. Only the Social Democrats dared to oppose the idolatry of money. So God worked through them. Cutter voted for Social Democrats, but didn't belong to the party or any party. And he didn't believe in social activism. The only revolution he cared about was God's. Ragaz agreed about God and social democracy and disagreed about social activism, ethical idealism, and party politics. So there were two schools of religious socialism in Switzerland. Each camp had its own journal, and Ragaz was called to the theology chair at Zurich. There he developed a theology of hope, conceiving God as the power of the future, the ground of hope that wills the redemption of all people and the earth. Edward Ternuysen observed to Barth that Ragaz and Cutter were different from the German theologians. God really mattered to these Swiss Christian socialists. That's what got Barth's attention, leading him into religious socialism. Germany invaded Belgium, the German professors cheered, and Barth told a famous story about his reaction. It's the founding narrative of 20th century theology, and it was exaggerated. Barth got the date wrong. Only 3 of his teachers signed it. His career did not consist of a series of dramatic conversions. It took him 6 years to break from liberal theology. His development of an analogical method was elongated too, as we've said for a great deal around here at Princeton. He never stopped being a dialectical theologian, and he remained a socialist for the rest of his life, though not a religious socialist. His path to Barthian theology was far more winding and complex than he said, because he told the story from the standpoint of his later theology, and because conversion stories are dramatically compelling. The war accentuated the differences between Ragaz and Cutter. Ragaz blasted German militarism, condemned the war, and excoriated the imperialist greed for colonies and plunder that caused the war. Militarism, he said, is the offspring of demonic human power, a form of spiritual sickness. Cutter sympathized with Germany and quietly cheered for a German victory. Ideologically, Cutter was a Kautsky Marxist and Ragaz was a Bernstein Democratic Socialist, albeit to the left of Bernstein, who thought the British Empire was only half bad. Barth was torn between them. He admired Ragaz's courage in supporting the general strike of 1912 and railing against the war. Meanwhile, Cutter apologized to Germans for the Swiss socialists who blamed Germany for the war. The moral argument favored Ragaz, but Ternuysen cautioned Barth that Cutter's emphasis on waiting for God contained a deeper spiritual wisdom than Ragaz's activism. Ragaz conflated too readily the gospel faith with the politics of democratic socialism. By the fall of 1915, Barth agreed with Ternuysen that Christians need to wait upon a God who does not validate human plans. The kingdom of Christ is a new world breaking into the existing world that challenges everything human. He thanked Ternuysen for helping him see the eschatological difference. This was the crucial turn in Barth's twisting and turning path to a Neo-Reformation theology. I agree with Ingrid Spiekermann and Bruce McCormick that Barth's turn in 1915 over Cutter versus Ragaz is the key one in his thought. If Cutter was better than Ragaz, Barth had to start over, waiting upon a wholly other God of grace and glory. But Barth's denigration of Ragaz was wrong, dishonest, opportunistic, and baleful for modern theology. World War I was so shattering for the SPD that the ideologies it lived by were scrambled. Most of the SPD capitulated to the Kaiser, terrified of being trampled to death in a pro-war stampede. German socialists who opposed the war had to find individual paths to each other, creating a new party, the Independent Social Democratic Party, USPD. Kautsky, Bernstein, and Luxemburg founded it in 1917. Ragaz would have been in it had he been German. As it was, he was the North Star of Christian socialism, blasting racism, empire, and militarism, upholding democratic socialist principles, supporting the USPD, steadfastly opposing the communist flank of the USPD, espousing gender equality and feminist criticism, and calling the church and academy to care about social justice, both of which let him down, so he quit the academy. Barth ridiculed Ragaz out of competitive rivalry, which obscured that Barth borrowed key theological tropes from Ragaz, and that Barth and Ragaz held similar political principles. The biggest difference is that Ragaz actually lived by them. Ragaz described religion as idolatry, the consecration of a corrupt social order. He contrasted the kingdom of God with it, and he identified the gospel with the promise of a new divine order. Barth took over and refashioned this entire constellation of ideas, now as reasons to oppose religious socialism. In 1919, the issue in Germany was whether the USPD would join the newly founded Communist International. Ragaz implored democratic socialists to stand against what they hated: imperialism, dictatorship, and militarism. Leninism was all three. It was not socialism in a hurry or the best that Russians could manage. Ragaz did not identify the kingdom of God with movements for social justice and peace. He persistently described social movements as signs of the kingdom, and he distinguished between relative and absolute hopes of the kingdom. He acknowledged that he didn't know exactly where to draw the line between his Christian faith and his social activism. Politics is essentially about the struggle for power, and the gospel is opposed to power politics. But Christian faith and the political struggle for justice do overlap, and Ragaz contended that the overlap cuts both ways. Socialism is a moral ideal and a form of community based on the principle of solidarity. It does not belong wholly to a political box. Ragaz said the socialist movement he experienced was partly political and partly religious in the Christian prophetic sense of the term, because on both sides, it sought to replace the old order of domination with a new order, a wholly new society of justice and solidarity. Socialism, he said, is a low-medium form of prophetic religion. Being political, it has no chance of reaching the kingdom level, but it's about the same things that the kingdom is about. He said he prayed to see democratic socialism and Christianity come closer together. That was not where Karl Barth wanted to land. He said it scathingly in September 1919. Brandy superbly recounted the historical backstory to the conference at Tambach. The crowd consisted mostly of USPD clerics and professors, with a sprinkling of SPD and evangelical Congress veterans. Most of this crowd was disgusted with the SPD for capitulating during the war and for persecuting communists afterward. They realized how pathetic their tradition was, and they saw the crisis of this moment that they were in, and they were looking for a word of encouragement and guidance in a desperate moment. Barth mocked them for organizing a conference on social Christianity. He was fully imbued with his discovery of Pauline eschatology. He said it was a perilous thing to take even the shortest step with Christ into society. They had to learn to wait upon a wholly other God in a wholly new way, learning from Paul that God alone saves the world. 3 months later, it was still important to him to place himself politically. In December 1919, he told a social democratic gathering that good socialism was a sentinel between two sorry paths. The SPD had lost its way, and communism wasn't the answer either. On his telling, he took the narrow path of the Sentinel. But the following year, Barth wrote his eschatological second edition of Romans. Half the USPD joined the Communist International, and Barth began what he later called his 10-year moratorium from politics. It was really more like 15 or 16 years, but give him 10. He headed for the academy and made his peace with the church, conceiving dogmatics as the normative language of the church. Barth could not have written a dogmatics had he kept saying that theology is like trying to draw a bird in flight. Meanwhile, Ragaz despaired of the church, the academy, and the church in the academy. All were corrupt and corrupting compared to community organizing, social justice activism, and the peace movement. He resigned his chair in the Zurich theology faculty in 1921 to devote himself wholly to activism and theological scholarship. In 1924, he put it personally, quote, "Now I am in the middle of a wilderness of what appears to be a godless world. In my fierce battle for the kingdom of God, in the midst of this world, I find that I receive no help, none whatsoever from the church, from organized religion. The church seems to me to be something non-essential. This is the word that keeps coming to my mind. There's so much edification, consolidation, and activity there, but there's no strength for changing the world, for actually changing the world. Rather, the church seems to be bent on comforting the world. The church is supposed to care about oppressed people, but it doesn't. And the academy has no reason to care about them." Barth knew very well that Ragaz was like Blumhardt, the real thing, impelled by Christian convictions, and not deserving of the sneering things that Barth said about him. 20 years later, Barth said the same thing as Tillich about why he came so late to taking the Nazi threat seriously. Nazi ideology was too absurd to take seriously, and he respected Germans too much to believe they would fall for it. In 1930, the Nazi vote skyrocketed to 18%, a reward for clashing with communists in the streets. The following year, Barth finally joined the SPD. He said the surge of Nazis got his attention. Quote, "In view of the fact that right-wing terror is gaining the upper hand, I thought it right to make it clear with whom I would like to be imprisoned and hanged." Unquote. That put it dramatically, but did not speak very well for the moratorium. Those 10 years that brought you to this conclusion. When Barth admonished his students all along the way to stay out of politics and all social justice movements. Hitler vengefully attacked the SPD when he gained total power in 1933. The SPD tried to avoid a bloodbath by self-liquidating. Office holders resigned from the party and destroyed their party cards. Tillich followed party discipline, resigning from the party, entreating Barth to do the same. Barth replied that, as usual, he and Tillich did not agree. Barth said he joined the SPD for 4 reasons. It was the party of the working class, of democracy, of anti-militarism, and of judicious patriotism. He stressed that these were concrete reasons. He did not claim any intrinsic affinity to Marxism as such, nor profess socialism as a religious worldview, the mistake of religious socialists like Tillich by his lights. To Barth, joining the SPD was strictly a practical political decision, an exercise of his God-given freedom to make political decisions. Barth was a socialist because the concrete goals of socialism had strong affinities to the kingdom of God. He did not think in terms of party discipline or ideology or really other people, so party directives just didn't apply to him. To him, the crucial relationship was between the gospel and socialism, not between theology and socialism. George has put this perfectly aptly for many years. To Barth, the crucial relationship was between the freedom and love of the living God and socialism. Barth took no interest in proving that theology and socialism are logically related or improving any Christian doctrine. Theology is the explication of revelation, secondary reflection on God's concrete reality as proclaimed in the gospel. Socialism is relevant to theology only to the extent that its goals conform to God's goals for the world. To Barth, theology clarified the goals. It does not relate to socialism as theory to theory, but as theory to practice. Certainly, that is a plausible position with a very ample theological legacy, one that I respect greatly. But I hold in very low regard Barth's nearly 20 years of telling students to stay out of social justice politics. I think it does follow directly and obviously chronologically straight from those eschatological sections of Romans to the position he takes just a year later. In 1933, he took aim at Tillich's band of religious socialists, boasting that he would cut them down the same way that he did to Ragaz. Quote, "I could damage the German religious socialists as badly as I did in 1919, as Ragaz bears witness." Unquote. Barth said he held in contempt anyone who talked about his politics or his political background. This chatter, he said, was unworthy of gentlemen. He talked like that until 1938, when Germany annexed Austria. Barth floated above politics except when he didn't, and he claimed not to be ideologically when he made exceptions. He was far more radical than the school of followers he inspired, with important exceptions: Helmut Gallwitzer, Paul Lehmann, Frederick Herzog, several others. Gallwitzer recognized that his friend was volatile, inconsistent, and complex, especially in this area. He knew that Barth's anti-capitalism and anti-militarism ran very deep. Barth came from the generation that witnessed the disgrace of the SPD, which went on to represent social democracy as something prosaic, shop-worn. The meaning of social democracy as a category changed after World War I. It was no longer the umbrella term uniting ultra-left socialists, orthodox Marxists, and democratic socialists. It became the name for what social democrats did when they attained power. They never achieved democratic socialism, a vision of radical democratic self-determination. They built social welfare states, now called social democracy. Barth had reason to feel that he was more anti-capitalist and radical than that. Yet he also deceived himself on this subject. When Barth dropped religious socialism during World War I, he traded radical democratic socialism for social democracy, where pragmatism reigned supreme in politics. This move reinforced his predisposition to identify politics with the state. Barth had no concept of politics that was not a politics of government. He completely missed guild socialism and all other movements for economic democracy that develop alternatives to the state fixation of state socialism. Intellectually, he was just too German to take up any tradition of non-statist theory or practice. Socialism was a serious thing to him only as state socialism. The only voluntary community that interested him was the church. And Barth's church existed mostly in his head. By relegating his socialism to an independent realm of pragmatic statist reform, Barth walled himself off from the deepest insights of socialist theory. He did not apply a socialist critique of the class struggle to the political issues he addressed. His later political writings criticized Nazism, the Cold War, West German rearmament, American capitalism, and Christian complicity from a moral perspective. He did not employ a socialist perspective on structural economic forces that drove the world to another world war, the way W.B. Du Bois did, and turned anti-communism into an obligatory Western religion. To Barth, viewing the world through a socialist lens smacked of ideology. His socialism was a private political opinion. But socialism is, most importantly, a tradition of ethical liberationist struggle and anti-capitalist criticism, not a checkbox on a ballot or a mere individual opinion about ownership. Thank you, friends.
Gary, thank you for that. Professor Dorrien sent me his paper early, very kindly. I didn't do that for Devin, so sorry, Devin. But said when he sent it, just in case you want to read this, you don't need to. I don't think you should, right? Like, I disagree. That just in that, I think there's much to soak up in that rich history and background and context. I feel like I needed, again, like a crash course or like a movie. Now I'm like imagining a movie situation, right? Of like Barth and the Socialists. I think that would actually be a fascinating movie. I don't know if Hollywood would agree. But I kind of want to watch it again on slow speed and like start to parse out. So I'm still processing a lot of this. I just have a few questions that I'm curious for us to all think through together. I think, Professor Dorrien, you raise a lot of the narrative you tell pushes back against some of the things I talked about. So I'm curious about thinking about what that might mean for us today. I guess, so again, some of the questions I have, Barth speaks about the dangers of like Christian socialism. And again, that quote that I had read about like atheistic, the theological argument for atheistic socialism. I would love to hear you, hear some of your more reflections on that. And I'm particularly compelled by the way in which you narrate the kind of trends of Christian socialism versus in Britain and England versus other forms of socialism. And I'm curious if you have any points of overlap or find anything compelling about Barth's critique of the kind of collapse between Christianity and socialism. This is a weird question. Like a lot of these questions are like, how would you, like, why do you think Barth won? Like the way that plays out, right? The comment at the beginning of like, Barth has been with us and is probably not going anywhere. Why do you think that is? Like, and what are the, both costs and benefits of that, particularly in relation to Ragaz, right? Like, what would it have looked like if Ragaz prevailed or had found an ally in Barth? Like, do you think it could look differently, and what would that be? And then my two kind of final questions here are selfish ones based on my own, but I want, like, I'm trying to take your paper to heart and kind of hearing that as like a pushback of like, here are some of the dangers of refusal. But I wonder if you think there's a space for refusal or negativity, and if that could look differently in a different key. Is there a way to do refusal theologically, theoretically, and or practically that is not floating above? I think the way you name that as Barth is floating above. And thinking here of Ragaz's resignation, both from his role as a professor in theology and effectively, right, his resignation of, the church being supposed to care about oppressed people and not, and the academy has no reason, right? Like, is refusal helpful there, right? Like, does Barth condition refusal? Did Barth condition the refusal he's calling for? Barth actually make his own argument true by his own actions, right? Like, and does that show us something, right? Like, which is kind of a weird, but I don't know if that makes sense. And I guess I'm curious in relation to that, like my final question is, do you see there's two claiming of a we, highlighting the ways in which solidarity happens? And I'm curious, and it might be no, right? But are there risks that you think Barth may have been onto something for, or that there are dangers there, but a way to think about them differently within this kind of narrative of history?
Thanks, Brandy. Those are wonderful questions, and actually one kind of gave way to the next. They're linked together. So rather than try to take them in sequence, I think I'll sort of honor the spirit in which they all kind of mesh together. And firstly, say yes. This will be known to some of you here and others. It'll help to make sense of what you just heard. I was a democratic socialist solidarity organizer for a decade before I joined a church, and for another 5 years before I became an academic. So I brought all of that with me into to joining a church. To even I could only have done so. It just never would have happened without Martin Luther King Jr. And then after finding out that people like Leonard Ragaz actually existed. If that church, if that thing hadn't existed where I could identify what my life was already very much about, see it in the church in some way, there's no way I end up joining and become ordained. Much less years later, I became an academic, because to me, coming from the world I came from, I'm in the academy is selling out, and you have to be able to justify. You have to be able to justify seeing the academy as a possible site of the kind of work that I was doing. And I was a latecomer to it in my generation. Mine is the first generation of democratic socialists like myself who were in the academy. The academy was not a site of much activity or organizational work on the democratic left until my generation came in the 1980s. It simply wasn't. This is the new left. These are children of the new left, now making the academy a side of it. And for me, this is all sort of a history and progress along the way. I mean, this all happened while I'm on my way. Yes. Even though I have all these books out there that look like they're in two entirely different fields and how do these things relate together, all of it just comes from having been deeply committed to the work of democratic socialist groups, little bitty groups too. I am almost a founder of DSOC, the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee. I joined it a few months after it started. I think at our peak we had like 7,500 members, and we're the successor to that old left dream of uniting all the leftisms. So we're what we call a multi-tendency formation, three-party formation. We don't have a line. We're not a vanguard organization. We don't, we have lots of different tendencies, and that kept us small. I mean, if we had just gone with one of them, we could at least, hit 10,000. But we are small by virtue of the fact we're this impossible thing, right? We're working on something that's not well enough defined. It's democratic socialist, whatever that means to a variety of people, and it's that whole mess that I, started with here. It's a certain understanding that, it can mean these different things. So yes, we're multi-tendency, and you can't live in that kind of work. Can't do it without some keen sense of just what you're up against, of just how overwhelming it is, and that you're getting ground down, and it just feels overwhelming. And then later I was a founder of DSA when we had two of us little left groups came together and founded Democratic Socialists of America. And George and I have been hanging in there with them ever since. The trajectory of that, the ethos of it, the character, even certain strategic arguments about relationships to liberalism, and just what it is that ever gets you down the road politically, all of that was deeply in me long before I found my way to this place and into Dan's classroom and tried to find my way in Christian theology. So yeah, it's I carry the sort of burden, all of that, and its limitations and its frustrations, and the need to have found at least a few people along the way where I recognize something. That's earlier today I heard three superb papers before I walked in here today from Joseph and Christopher and Lisa. And especially, my goodness, from Joseph, that whole argument about the black political left, I was with you every word. I mean, it's a very similar sort of argument about just the sheer necessity of politics. Politics is the sphere whereby the poor and dispossessed people at least have a chance of not getting crushed. Where that is always the question about what kinds of organizations, as you were saying, are we building that even serve as some kind of countervailing forces against these overwhelming forces that are just crushing us. That's me in this paper, and it is implicitly or explicitly the answer to sort of all these questions. It's not as though I don't see dangers. It's not just difficult. This kind of work, it can be pressing. It's every bit difficult as just ordinary community, except here you at least have the possibility of this district organizing, scaling up to something that's just beyond a community. Where you work community organizing, which I've done for years, your nose is always just pressed right against the grindstone. You're always just working at, can we get a grocery store in the black neighborhood? I mean, my God, I was involved in an organization. We worked 10 years on that. And that's the greatest victory I've ever had in community organizing. It was just that, something that small, but that palpable. That's working in that kind of social justice activism. I do look for company, and if I couldn't identify folk, a handful like Ragaz, who did it all along, who were exemplars of it and kind of lights for me. I know I'd be involved in this work. I know I wouldn't be in the church.